excited. Thank you to Creative Mornings for having me here in the space. Thank you to Arts Mission Oak Cliff for allowing us in. Like Nikki shared, my name is Victoria Ferrell-Ortiz. Let's get into some of my identifiers. So I use she, her pronouns. I'm multi-ethnic, so my father is a person of color but was adopted by my paternal grandparents who are white, which is why I have the last name Ferrell. But then my mother's family is Mexican-American and from West Dallas, and so I live in a place of intersectionality, and that really informs a lot of the work that I do today. Growing up, it was confusing for me as a child to see the disparities in my family's lived experiences. And so I use that as kind of like the fuel for a lot of the advocacy and racial equity work that I do today. I'm a barrio historian, and so for those of you who aren't Spanish speaking, I'm not necessarily fluent in Spanish myself, but I know just enough to order food, the important things. But barrio means neighborhood in Spanish. And a barrio is a barrio because of the demographic of people that exist in it. So if a neighborhood is predominantly Latinx, Hispanic, Mexican-American, it could be considered a barrio, and there are several barrios of Dallas. We're in a barrio of Dallas right now, Oak Cliff, one of the best barrios in my opinion. Thank you. But there are others as well, right? There's Little Mexico, El Pozo, La Bajada, Los Altos, El Aceite. There's so many barrios of Dallas, and it's very important to know about that history because it's a huge part of our city's overall history. I'm a daughter, partner, and mother. I have a 5-year-old daughter named Emily. I'm a cultural artist, and so I really try my hand at different things, and I'm not afraid to do different things, even though that might not be my expertise. I've made documentary films, I've sewn dresses, I do digital collage. Over the Christmas break, I was bored, and so I made a lino cut stamp for the first time. But like I said, specifically I'm from Oak Cliff in West Dallas, but West Dallas is a larger area, and of West Dallas, I'm from Ledbetter or Eagle Ford, but Cemento Grande specifically. And I'm an ancestor in the making, and so what that means to me is considering our lineage, those who have come before us, but then also those who will carry on our legacy. And so thinking about who your personal ancestors are in your history is really important to not only the work that you do, but also to our future, because we have a collective future that we're all building together. And then I'm an advocate of equitable urban planning. So urban planning is what designates what goes where, and it shows a lot of society's values and cultural structures. And so urban planning has been used historically as a tool to sometimes displace or to perpetuate environmental injustices. And so I'm a co-founder and executive director of an urban planning nonprofit that fights against the usage of tools in a way that is not inclusive. So an outline of our talk today. I think I'm gonna move. So I can see better. An outline of our talk today is going over the roots of corruption, but specifically within development. We'll watch a clip of Faces of Cement City, which is a short film that I was interviewed for, and that was created by Tropic Pictures and Teatro Dallas, a Latinx theater troupe here in Dallas, Texas. And then talking about the different next steps that you have to fight corruption within the city of Dallas. This is an example of the digital collage that I do. It's called Even in Death. And so I have family members that are buried at Campo Santo de Cemento Grande. We'll watch the film that addresses some of this, but this is signage that was applied at the fence around the perimeter of a building that was built in front of the cemetery that blocked access to the cemetery, so people who wanted to visit their loved ones couldn't really do that anymore. And so for a while, we would have to sneak in either while someone who worked at the office space was entering or exiting the gated parking lot. But then after complaining, they allowed this to happen. So they added signage for us to call the security to be buzzed in. But basically the idea is just, like even in death, people are not given the opportunity to have the eternal peace and rest. So corruption. The definition of corruption is dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery. And so what I plan to dive in today isn't necessarily bribery, but it's just going back to corruption and a signatory of corruption being misalignment of values away from racial equity. So in development, we have development idealism, and development idealism is kind of what you see perpetuated by people's beliefs or values that identify the appropriate goals of development and the ends for achieving those goals. It includes beliefs about positive cause and effect relationships among such factors as economic growth, educational achievement, health, political outcomes, as well as strong values regarding many attributes such as gender equality or democratic governance. And this cultural model has been pushed from its origins among the elites of Northwest Europe to elites and ordinary people throughout the world through colonization. Developmental idealism has become so entrenched in local, national, social structures that it is now even taken for granted as the status quo. Just because one group of people develops one way does not mean that everyone should, right? We have different cultural values, and those cultural values should be aligned with how we build and how we develop. There is this quote by Angela Gurria: integrity, transparency, and the fight against corruption have to be part of the culture. They have to be taught as fundamental values. So like I stated, I am multi-ethnic. I saw a lot of disparities in my family's lived experiences, and I didn't understand why those were the case because my family didn't really talk about racism. My family didn't understand racism being the cause of what we see playing out systemically in our communities. But this is a picture of my Grammy, my paternal grandmother, who developed dementia and then was placed into a memory care facility. And that was kind of like a trigger for me to think about, well, my Grammy, who I knew her as, her real name was Betsy. And so whenever Betsy was placed in this memory care, I thought about like, well, what do I really know about Betsy? And the truth was that I didn't know enough. And so that window of opportunity had closed for me, but it gave me the opportunity to also assess what I still had access to. And what I did have access to was my maternal grandmother's history, because my maternal grandmother was still doing well enough to be able to share those histories with me. So I turned over to my abuela, Lupe Varara Chapa, and one of the first things that she shared with me was that she was a cementera. And like I shared earlier, my Spanish isn't great, so I had to ask her, what does that mean? What does being a cementera mean to you, abuela? And she told me that, we were the people who helped build up the city of Dallas, and that we had ancestors who lived and worked on the Trinity Portland Cement Company town known as Cemento Grande. And this is the first time that I ever heard that history. I'm a product of DISD. My mom was an educator within the school district, and yet it was something that I had never heard about. No teacher ever brought it up in school. And so it gave me the opportunity to connect to that history of the Trinity Portland Cement Company town. But I have to name, like this land, these are pictures of my family members, but then also the cement company itself, and then a cement bag. But this land, before it was developed, was first like indigenous land, and it was stolen land. In 1907, William Foster Cowan purchased the cement plant. It was named the Eagle Ford. The community was named Eagle Ford because of it being part of a rock structure that also included cement shell or limestone. And so it derives its name from the outcrops of the banks of the West Fork of the Trinity River near the old community of Eagle Ford, which is now a neighborhood within the city of Dallas. So people worked very hard here. They were Mexican immigrants. Whenever they were building up this town, they realized that in order to have workers, they were going to have to provide housing for their workers as well. And so they made a call towards Mexico and South Texas for people to come out and begin working to break up rock to be turned into cement. And they worked long hours, 11-hour days, and it was hard labor. The way that my abuela put it was just like rock crushing. And my abuela's grandfather on a census was actually listed as being a literal rock crusher. But one story that we'll see later is I interviewed a woman named Elsa Cadena who grew up on this town, and she shared how the town, the housing that they provided was even segregated at that time. And so you had white foremen whose homes were built in a place along the company to where cement would not fall on their homes, but it would fall on Mexican workers' homes or black workers' homes. And that sediment prevented growth of like flora. So no grass was present in their front yards, they just had dirt. But Elsa shared a story where as a child, whenever her father would take them out of town to the market, she would always ask to pass by the foreman's houses because she wanted to pretend that one of the houses belonged to her as a child. So her and her sister would fight over like, oh, this house is mine. Oh no, this house with like the picket fence and the roses was mine. But that was something that they weren't able to have themselves just because of the way that the housing structures were developed. And then we have Cemento Grande. Cemento Grande was created whenever the Spanish influenza happened in 1918. Many children died at this time. It was the last pandemic that we had outside of COVID. But my abuela's brother is one of those children that is buried there. And so I mentioned earlier that there is actually this AT&T development, right? So AT&T has a business office space right in front of the cemetery. And it's ironic because, after building their office space, they built a parking lot around it, and people's bodies are covered by the material that sourced their livelihood. There are people whose bodies are covered by a parking lot there now. And so it creates separation and induces not just like historical trauma, like nods to having to do like very hard, laborious work that was so dangerous that the Trinity Portland Cement Company in town would even celebrate safety picnics. So if a certain amount of days passed without an accident happening, they would throw a party in order to incentivize not getting hurt in some aspect because it was such dangerous work that they were having to do. And this is because of regulations, but also because of a lack of care. This, however, of course, is not an alone occurrence, and you all probably know this already. The way that we choose to utilize our land says a lot about our values and our vision for society, and it says a lot about our culture, and can be a litmus test for corruption. because I'm in urban planning and I work in urban planning, sometimes I hear the phrase highest and best use quite often. And that is something that tends to veer towards capitalism. Not to say that everything about capitalism is wrong, right? I'm entertaining capitalism myself, as someone who takes a paycheck for the work I do. But it's just the highest and best use does not always signify culture and sustaining culture, unfortunately. So part of the reason that we don't know about Cemento Grande, and then can I also ask you all a question? How many of you knew about Cemento Grande before me mentioning it today? So 1, 2, 3, 3 people. And so thinking about why is that? Why is this history undertold? Why isn't this part of a curriculum that we're taught in public schooling? Or who's at the table whenever histories are being recorded, whenever they're being archived? And is that history being told for a particular agenda, or is it to just, put things on the record for future use? And so I think one of the biggest examples of corruption in the founding of our nation is just that. I think many of you have probably seen this photo of the quote-unquote Thanksgiving that we get sold. My daughter is 5, and so I had to have a very real conversation with my daughter's pre-K teacher about not doing Indian headdresses as an arts craft, or doing the whole chicken turkey finger thing, There are ways to talk about genocide and be age appropriate without being dishonest about our history. There is an excerpt from a book called Texas Indian Troubles. And so it's a book that chronicles the conflicts between Native Americans and other settlers in Texas by Bedford. The main object of this book will be to place on record a correct history of the facts connected with and the sacrifices made by the early settlers in order to redeem this great land from the hand of the roving Indians that has always occupied it and had done nothing to improve or develop it. So that to me was very important as someone who does urban planning advocacy, because it talks about the development and the quality of the land. It's basically an assessment, but from their purview. And so again, the culture point is very, very important because it prioritizes what you play out in your vision for land. And so I have another question for you all. Can you raise your hand if you've ever heard of the neighborhoods of Little Mexico, Short North Dallas, or Little Jerusalem? And so I see quite a few more for those, which is great. Those are histories that I didn't necessarily connect with until around 2017. And so knowing them and knowing that those are neighborhoods that are in large part gone today is very important for cultural preservation, historic preservation, and the preservation of our neighborhoods and barrios. So on February 8th, 1887, President Grover Cleveland signed the Dawes Act into law, breaking up tribal communities and institutionalizing the theft of over 90 million acres of Indian land. The act is intending to solve the quote-unquote Indian problem, same thing that I mentioned previously, through assimilation, deliberately forced Native communities into a capitalistic relationship with land as opposed to the cultural and spiritual relationship of prior millennia. Teddy Roosevelt celebrated the Dawes Act as a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. The Dawes Act's land privatization was later overturned by the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, but nothing was done in return to rectify the theft of huge swaths of native land. The legacy of this forced displacement is still felt in indigenous land struggles in the modern era. Land continues to be stolen, and not by happenstance, by deliberate federal policy, and that history is not always named and told. And so this is a Hulk map where it shows like redlining within communities, and this is specific to Dallas. Dallas was the number 7 most racially segregated city in the US in 2017. There is even a 15-year difference in life expectancy between the highest income and lowest income zip codes. And so you can see that broken up in part by this map. And a lot of that has to do with industry, but then the opportunity to build up generational wealth was often denied to people of color because of the way that this map assessed the value of Black people or other people of color. Certain neighborhoods were even labeled as being infiltrated by Black people. And if some of you are homeowners, you can look at your deed, and sometimes you'll find language within the deeds that say, like, you know, a certain person cannot own this home, and it has a lot to do with this. And so this is still playing out today, that historical disinvestment, thinking about our sidewalks, for instance, or just basic infrastructure that certain neighborhoods have more of than others. My dad's family lived in Richardson, and my mom's family lived in West Dallas and Oak Cliff, and so I would go back and forth and wonder why there was investment in places like Richardson, but you know, the sidewalks around my Oak Cliff home were breaking up, or there were no sidewalks at all sometimes in West Dallas. And so this you can see the red portions that come out of the city center, and then the yellow, the blue, and Oak Cliff is largely yellow at this point. And so this denied people of color the opportunity to build up generational wealth via home ownership, because mortgage companies would not approve them because of just, you know, plain out racism, but also considering who their neighbors were and wanting to keep certain neighborhoods as white as possible. So then we have Faces of Cement City. This is the documentary short I had been talking to you about that was produced by Tropic Pictures in collaboration with Teatro Dallas, and it interviews myself and my abuela, along with other community members that are important to Cemento Grande history. That's a picture of us there, but I'll go ahead and let the short play.
Maria Orozco Cadena. My family arrived in Dallas on September 16, 1947. We were the last family that moved into Cemento Grande, and I was 6 years old. We went to school. We went to Eagle Ford. And if you lived in Cemento Grande, there were no churches out there. I mean, we were very, very much isolated. Most of the people that lived out there, they had livestock. I can't believe some of the changes. I never thought I would see it in my lifetime. I go to Pinnacle Park, and where our little village was, is where Walmart is. And it's just amazing the changes that have happened in my lifetime. Chalk Hill Road. it was a two-lane road, and I mean, I've been coming through there for 70 years, or, you know, because I mean, everybody, that's what you had to travel, Singleton, a two-lane road. And I see all that, and I'm just amazed at the changes. But then in the back of my mind, I want to say, are these changes really for us? Or are they for the people that are coming that do not look like us?
I don't really have a lot of respect for developers that are coming into this area displacing people who have been here for generations.
Dios míos.
Can you say your dad's name? Your dad's name?
Este es mi papá, Ricardo Barrera.
I think that a lot of the stores that are being put up like in Trinity Groves, their commerce isn't for people in this area because the food is too expensive. You know, or we don't feel comfortable going there. My grandmother's received like offers for this house for like 30 grand, and she bought the house for 20 grand in 1992. 10 grand profit over 25 years. She like almost took it because like 30 grand to her is a lot of money, you know. She's like, should I take it? I'm like, no, you don't take that. You don't take like the very least of what someone is willing to offer. And where would she be able to go in Dallas to buy a house for 30 grand? Nowhere.
The cemetery itself was donated to the Ledbetter Neighborhood Association from Lafarge Corporation, which was the cement company. That cemetery was given for the people that worked at Cement City. That was their private cemetery to the workers and people that lived in that Cemento Grande. The cemetery itself was supposed to be 2.2 acres of ground. To my knowledge, it was about close to 300 that was buried there. And then when AT&T came about, that's when they were digging all the grounds back in where the cemetery was, you know, building left and right, stores, restaurants and stuff. I believe they excavated the remains of the people that were buried there. And I don't know what they did. They did away with them. That's when my dad came through and stopped the excavation. And he said that he didn't want to see that no more because his family was buried there. And if you go right now, this day, you see like maybe 15, 20 headstones there. I believe they excavated the remains of the people that were buried there. I believe the people that were buried there are underneath that concrete in the parking lot.
Thank you. So you can see that my abuela, for instance, she is one of many elders in the community who receive like constant solicitations for her home. And like I shared, 30 grand is a lot of money, especially to someone like her who's never had 30 grand all at once before. And so having an offer like that for someone who isn't necessarily aware of the value of their property, it's very discriminatory, and basically elders are being targeted for their land whenever they don't have family or friend to kind of consult to think about like, well, this is something that has been presented to me. I know that there are people who do get taken advantage of, you know, and so there are people who get gypped and ripped off, and it's very concerning because, again, just having a home passed down within a family, it can really be everything that someone needs in order to like have a step up in life. And so that kind of again denies people the opportunity to build up generational wealth through home ownership. It's not the only way to do it, but it's one. In the city of Dallas, there are 49 Black, Latinx, Hispanic neighborhoods that are surrounded by industrial uses as opposed to one white neighborhood. And so growing up in West Dallas, I felt that. West Dallas is a beautiful community because of the people that we have there. We're resilient, we're creative, people are so funny, and you know, like just the family values that are there, but the industry that is also there is really a testament to our city's values. Thinking about why is it okay for industry, for polluters to be so close to residential homes, whereas that would never happen in Richardson, where my father's family is from, or Highland Park, or Park Cities. You know, that would never happen there, but it's okay for that to happen to Floral Farms, West Dallas, Joppy, it goes on. And so I even have asthma as a result of growing up in West Dallas. A lot of my West Dallas cousins have asthma, and so it's a long-term cost that we're having to pay for like maintaining inhalers or breathing treatments. And you know, it's something that I think about every time whenever my asthma gets triggered for whatever reason. I think about that, and if I would have had asthma at all had I grown up in Richardson instead with my mom's family. So, all that being said, there are so many ways to fight corruption, and narrative change is one of them. Thinking about who's telling your story, and the truth is that no one can tell your story the way that you can, the way that your ancestors have really foretold what would happen, and thinking about how you can record that history if you still have family members who are living. Even if you don't have biological family, there's opportunities to record history with your chosen family members. And I think that's really important to name because narrative change has so much power. I, along with others, have done a lot of work in preserving Cemento Grande, and so thinking about if we had not have done this, how many other people would not have known the story. Besides that, policy reform is the playbook. So changing policy really shifts power structures and creates even playing field for our city, but any municipality, because they operate off of policies that are their code of conduct, right? And so thinking about how to reform those things, and to also consider the how, because that does matter a lot, especially in urban planning. Beyond that, education. My family didn't know how to be civically involved. They didn't know about reaching out to their city council people or how to reach out to their appointed officials on city commissions or committees. And so thinking about who represents you, who is at the horseshoe there. It's literally their job to represent you and your interests. So never ever feel like you're getting on their nerves. Even if you are, it's fine. They're getting paid for it, and so that's why they're there. Let's keep going. But that brings me to RIO planning, and so I incorporated RIO planning in 2021 in order to help fight some of these symptoms of corruption, right? But specifically in land use planning. And so this is me and some of our board. My co-founders, Jennifer Angel, who's an urban planner for ICP, and then Evelyn Mayo, who works at Paul Quinn College. So we kind of consider ourselves like a watchdog for direct advocacy opportunities and have done a lot of work around the West Oak Cliff Area Plan here in Oak Cliff. The West Oak Cliff Area Plan, if you were not aware, is a sub-area plan of the overall comprehensive land use plan for Dallas. In this plan, there were recommendations that would have displaced auto-centric uses, would have opened the door to displacing auto-centric uses in WOCAP. And so that is really important to counter because so many auto-centric businesses like the tire shops, the auto shops here in Oak Cliff are Latinx, Hispanic owned. Besides homeownership, having a small business is a really big way of building generational wealth, and in fact, a lot of them had inherited their business from their parents and were hoping to do the same to pass on that legacy. But this recommendation might have offset that. And so RIO, along with Somos Tejas, the West Oak Cliff Coalition, door knocked to make sure that these auto shops knew that this was happening so that way they can organize and defend themselves against it. And so they got the language changed. And so that's an example of how collaborating with others and being in association with others can really have a lot of power and help shift the power dynamic even now, because they're doing a lot of advocacy work with like a zoning change that happened on Hampton and 12th. If you were keeping tabs on that around a drive-through car wash displacing for small owned businesses, it was a drive-through car wash that would have happened that was being proposed by a developer in Houston and would have displaced 4 small locally owned auto shops here in Oak Cliff. But that's just some of what we do. Our mission is to close the health, wealth, and opportunity gap in communities through land use planning, policy creation, and cultural preservation. And we do that via our programs. So community education, which is felt through our People-Powered Planning Academy for Racial Justice, which just kicked off a few weeks ago here in Oak Cliff. We train and educate people on how to organize around urban planning matters. We do neighborhood planning, so we help write plans that protect neighborhoods, and we're doing this right now in the city of Lubbock, conducting one neighborhood plan for Dunbar, Manhattan Heights, as well as Jackson Mahon, and developing a policy in tandem with those 2 neighborhood plans. We do direct advocacy, so if residents are experiencing a certain issue, we'll do research around that within city code. We listen to the community's concerns and work with them or on their behalf in instances where people might be too uncomfortable to go to speak at city council or CPC meetings. We'll do that for you. And then reforming city planning. That reform piece is felt through policy creation, which is also an example of what we're doing in Lubbock because of the policy that we're making that complements the neighborhood plans that we're doing. But in order to do that, we reform city planning by making changes to current urban planning policies and practices to redress today's inequities. Urban planning is just a tool. It's really how you use it, who it's being used for, and for what end. So your questions, what are your thoughts? Do you have any impressions or questions that you'd like to ask? I'm happy to hear them. Yeah, Rachel.
On the maps that are showing redlining, could you explain a little bit what each of the colors signify?
Yeah, we'll go back. Okay. So red is already infiltrated, so that means that people of color already live in this neighborhood, largely Black communities. The book, The Accommodation, talks about some of this, thinking about how Black communities were targeted, and even how whenever Black people tried to have home ownership and develop communities for themselves, they received violence in return. So people would show up and try to burn their houses down or use intimidation tactics to try to push them out. Yellow is in danger. So there wasn't like a high percentage rate of people of color existing within the boundaries, but there were a few popping up, and it's interesting. I've heard a mentor share a story about this where she bought a home in Oak Cliff in the 70s, and her realtor was a white gentleman, and she didn't realize that he was actually her neighbor, and he decided to sell his home shortly after she moved in. She was a Latina, and so it's interesting the different players that are at stake, you know, and just thinking about the power that you have to leverage in every situation, because even if you think that you don't have influence, you do. Even if you're not a renter, if you're not on the market to buy a home, there's opportunities to show solidarity with communities outside of your own lived experience. Thank you for that question.
So my understanding of redlining is so letter to implementation, banks were not giving loans for buying homes to people of color, as well as the home that were owned. They were not getting loans for fixes and improvements, so they were not able to. That was a direct disinvestment in these communities. And so when we look at today, how would you describe your vision of equitable investment in these communities that have historically been disinvested? What would equitable investment look like?
I think it would have to be community-led, because development has not been community-led in the past. So having neighborhoods truly engaged, and not just engaged to the point to where, we hosted a meeting whenever we had time during a lunch hour and one person showed up, so we feel good about that. We have to do real engagement. Rio really enjoys canvassing. We think that door knocking and doing flyers and mailers is a really great way of getting as many people out as possible. However, that's not always the way that things are done, because it does take a lot of time. But to go back to your question, I think it being community-led, so that way each community is able to share their values and vision for their neighborhood, because it's their experience and their expertise that they would be able to develop towards and build towards. It should be those who are most directly impacted leading that front, and not others with their own agenda.
So specifically for like Latinx and indigenous communities, like oral history is such a big part of our culture. So what is documenting or like preserving that history actually look like? Like where does it go? How is it stored?
It depends how you do it. Are you asking for your own personal usage?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit, but I've always wondered where would I go if I want more knowledge, beyond the people in my own family?
Yeah. There are some organizations that exist. I'm happy to connect with you after this. I think that the 7th floor of the Dallas Public Library downtown has really great resources. There are archives through different universities that are really great as well. And so thinking about the different connections and collections that exist already, oral history is actually a mechanism of history keeping that is gaining more notoriety because of the way that our histories have been erased in the past, and we know that oral history is a way for us to have a window to that past because it hasn't been written enough. So there's this really big worship of the written word in history, practice. However, oral history is, like I said, really coming up. If you wanted to interview a family member, the iPhone is amazing now. just using your voice notes on your phone, having a quiet space, asking people to, silence their phones so that way you don't get some kind of notification during an interview, but you set it down on your phone. And it's funny because whenever I talk about interviewing my abuela, right? I had no oral history training at that point, and really you don't, it's not absolutely necessary. You can pick it up and go on your own. But now I do, and so there's certain practices that I keep in working with institutions, like having a letter of release and making sure that consent is spoken about throughout the entire process. But if it's just for you and your family, having your phone and just having a list of questions, and also thinking about the end goal. Like, what would you like to do with your recordings, your interviews after this? Is it just for you and your personal use, or is it something that you would like to submit to an archive to be a tool for future generations?
I have a question kind of piggybacking off of yours. So you mentioned early on that you hadn't been told about Cemento Grande in growing up in the DISD system, and that triggered my mind because one of my best friends teaches Texas history in DISD to a student population that includes a lot of Latinx students. So my question would be, are there any resources that you recommend for people who are now in the position of teaching those students? And I might also come forward afterwards to hear some of the resources you recommend.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Unfortunately, what is it called? Mexican American Studies in DISD, the programming is underfunded, and it's actually being attacked as a subset of critical race theory. And so it is something that I worry for, because, I don't know how many of you are from Texas and received Texas history, but it's a very patriotic version of everything that happened. And so it'll have you rooting for the Cowboys and, like the settlers of the West. But I think there is a great need for, AAPI studies, Mexican American studies, or other Latino populations, African American studies, so that way children can see themselves in our history. Unfortunately, Texas history didn't do enough of that to really shed that light. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Yes?
So thank you for your talk. I thought it was awesome. I see like the idea of generational wealth, which you talk a lot about, in general, kind of puts a bad taste in my mouth. But it seems like a vehicle for inequality to develop, basically, over time. But I also see that, like, me, if me as a white person saying, oh, well, generational wealth is a problem, in general, let's just turn that off. There's a major issue there if we were to do that now, after, white people have had generations to benefit from it. And so I wonder, I don't necessarily, whether or not you agree with the premise that there's a problem with generational wealth, can you see a way for, someone like me who does see a problem with it to square that with, there's obviously this inequality that's been able to amass over time because of it, and that it would be completely unfair at this point to tell people, hey, well, we're not doing that anymore. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought exercise. To what you've said, I think that it would be inequitable to try to pull the plug on it now, just as people are trying to build up something after not having the opportunity for years, whether that be to the fact that, like, you have ancestors who were formerly enslaved, or doing free crop practices, or there's a lot of factors, right? But I think that the thought exercise is interesting, and I think that co-ops are an interesting example of maybe that, like co-ownership. But it is something that does give me pause ultimately. Like I said, we can sometimes offer constructive criticism to capitalism as a whole, but at the same time, I'm playing into that, just considering the work that I do and thinking about how I don't necessarily want to try to go off and survive in nature. I don't think I would do great at that, but it's a great question, and I don't necessarily think that I have the answer. Mm-hmm.
I understand you have an artist in residency here at Arts Mission Oak Cliff. What are some of the projects you hope to work on during that time?
Thank you. Yes, I do. And so I'm doing the Es un lugar importa exhibit. Es un lugar importa means that this place matters. It's a historic preservation campaign to record and celebrate the contribution of auto-centric uses, auto shops that are owned by small Latinx, Hispanic business owners here in Oak Cliff, to think about the culture, the thread of the overall culture of our barrio that they contributed to Oak Cliff. And so I have bits and pieces in my studio downstairs right now. Y'all, the room is packed with all these different photos that are stacked, but then some really cool airbrushed pieces that are going to be on display as well. We've already had one workshop, which was a artifact collection workshop where people submitted their photos or art pieces. I have a stand that is line brushed like a lowrider car. That is pretty cool. But our next workshop is on conservation districts. So designation as protection and looking at a historical preservation as a way of protecting the overall culture of your neighborhood. Yes.
Something I keep thinking about is how the city's identity has been portrayed in the media and pop culture as very white. And so I think that there's this huge opportunity artistically and creatively to say no, these are the people who literally built this city. Because usually, when you think of Dallas, you think of maybe the skyline and blue bonnets and a white guy in top of that, or the show Dallas, or just something you just think white people. And or that's what you see a lot of this. So I think that there's this huge opportunity from creative or artistic or even media standpoint to say no, there's so much more than that. I'm also really excited about this documentary for that reason.
Thank you so much. And I agree, it's multifaceted. If you look at the demographics of our population, we're not only white, we're not only Latinx, we're not only Black or Asian American. We have so many different people who make up the city of Dallas, and everyone deserves to have their history and story celebrated and amplified in the space. Like I said, just thinking about a child, the child that I was, being multi-ethnic and not really feeling like I had a place or a story that was worth celebrating. Being able to have access to that at a younger age, to be affirmed by that history, would have been huge in my personal development as a leader, but then also considering the work that I do now. It would have given me more time to really hone my skills and think about my overall goals and contribution to our city's history, but I agree.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.